All right, is this working now?
Yes.
Now I need to go back into Meetup and change the links back. Not the way I wanted this to go.
Can you hear us?
Yeah, can anybody hear us? That is the $1 million question.
Yay, okay.
Okay, wonderful. All right, I'm so sorry, everybody. I don't know why, but for some reason the stream didn't go live until I created a second stream and went live with that one, and then the first one went live, and the second one was also live. And then we switched to the second one, and then we switched back to the first one. And you know what? The universe is a circle, and now we're here. So, 7 minutes late. I am Kevin Callanan. I am a program manager on the Angular team at Google. And I am joined by the one and only Alex Rickabaugh. He's the team lead for framework of Angular, also on the Angular team, as it happens at Google. No worries, Judith. And yeah, this is the June virtual meetup for Angular for Mountain View in San Francisco. So very happy to be here again. This will be available at the same link. If you can't watch the whole thing, or if you want to show it to a friend. But we're going to be talking about the control flow RFC. But before we get to that, just a little bit of recent news. So if you missed it, Angular version 16 is out now, and we actually also released Angular version 16.1. So lots of exciting stuff there. And we also have a couple RFCs. So you'll hear about one RFC today from Alex, but we also have another one on on a new primitive that you can check out. So those are both on GitHub. So we would absolutely love for you to check all of those out. Give us your feedback. Let us know how it's working for you and what you think. And this will help us guide Angular into the future. And that's why we want you all to be involved. So the way this works is I will stop talking momentarily because I don't have that much interesting stuff to say. Alex will talk about the control flow, and then we will go into a Q&A. But feel free to ask your questions during as well. If it's on topic, I will go ahead and interrupt Alex, and then we can address those. If they're more general questions, we'll probably leave them more towards the end, and then we can go through them and then as well. So yeah, Alex, take it away.
Sure. Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thanks for joining us. Hope you're having a wonderful Thursday evening, or if you're in Europe, kind of like crazy Friday morning, staying up late to watch this. I don't know. I guess this is a local meetup, but I've seen sometimes people join from much further away. That's one of the cool things about virtual meetups. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here, and Kevin, if you could
for you.
that up. Fantastic.
We'll put you on top because you are number one.
Thank you very much. So yeah, I don't have slides or anything. I thought we would go through kind of some of the proposed changes and the mechanisms behind them, kind of some of the thinking of why we're thinking of doing things this way. And rather than scroll through the RFC text itself, which is kind of hard to read on a video format, you can go to GitHub discussions and read that yourselves. I'm just going to kind of like improvise here in the HackMD tool, and yeah, talk about what we're thinking about and why. So if you haven't kind of been following the RFC, if you didn't see the kind of keynote at ngConf, we have two RFCs open at the moment. One is for what we call built-in control flow in Angular. And the second is for, as Kevin mentioned, a new primitive called Defer for doing template level lazy loading of components and directives and other dependencies. Both of these RFCs have been active for a couple weeks now, so there's quite a bit of commentary and discussion. Feel free to chime in. we'll probably be keeping them open through kind of the 4th of July holidays in the US, and then evaluate next month as kind of the stream of feedback starts to slow down. So they should be open for at least another week or so. But yeah, let's dive in and talk about control flow a little bit. So I thought I would get started actually by talking, giving some insight into the internals of Angular, how templates actually work, and how things like ngIf actually work under the hood. So this may be familiar if you're kind of an Angular power user, but we don't really go into detail about this stuff too much in the documentation. Our hope is kind of like the framework works for most people without needing to dive into the nitty-gritty details. So this might be new to some people. So if I am an Angular user and I write a component, so my component will have a selector, we'll say like app component maybe, and we have a template. Actually, I'm just gonna like write the template above, right? So my app component will have a template. And in this template, I will, maybe have like an H1 for my page. So this is like my cool web application. And a paragraph tag to say, hello friends, especially, my best friend, let's say. And then if, let's say I have a part of this template that I only want to show on the weekend, right? So we have a, let's say, a list here for the weekend, right? So ngIf is weekend. And within this list, I'm going to display a list of things. So let's say like, let activity of activities, right? And here we'll say like activity.name. So this is everything I'm doing this weekend. So this is a pretty simple component. And if you're not really familiar with Angular templates, you might kind of interpret this in the same way that you look at imperative control flow in JavaScript, saying like, like maybe, create H1, right? And then create a paragraph tag, and then if is weekend, like go ahead and create, or then I do like a for loop for let activity of activities, and then like create an LI and like do things with that. You might see this template as kind of one big chunk of DOM that gets rendered with some like loops and if statements and things inside of it. But Angular actually does not really think of templates in that way. We decompose the larger component template into this concept that we call views. That's VIEW, not VUE. And a view is a chunk of HTML, a fragment of the template that has completely static contents. And by static contents, I don't mean like text nodes that don't change or elements that don't have, like different classes at different points. I mean, the set of DOM elements that gets created for this template is static. So what does that look like in our example template here? So this example template decomposes into 3 different views. So I'll call them like view A here. And view A has the H1. It has the text binding. And it has a comment node in the DOM. That's weird. What's the comment node doing there? Where did that come from? Then we have a view B here. And this view B, if I get my syntax highlighting right, has within it a UL. And that UL has another comment node inside. Right? That's also kind of weird. And there's a third view that gets created. And this third view has within it, you might guess, an li, activity.name. No comment nodes in this one. What gives here? So what Angular has done, and you may have seen this if you know a little bit about how kind of the structural directive syntax works. Let's take a look at that. So this template, a star ngIf, is actually syntactic sugar. And it's syntactic sugar for declaring ng templates. This is called like the structural directive syntax. So this ng template actually contains a UL here. And the ngIf, even though it looks like it's a directive being applied to the UL, is actually a directive that gets applied to the template, the ng template element. And note that this is no longer a star ngIf, right? It's no longer being used as a structural directive. It is a plain directive on an ng template element. That's what structural directives are. It's shorthand syntax for put this directive on an ng template that wraps this element. And the same goes inside here for the li ngFor. So inside here, we have another template with an ngFor on it, actually an ngFor of activities. And then we have a let activity equals $implicit. That's kind of fancy. And here we have our li with our activity.name. So these two templates are actually equivalent. If I replaced my app component template with this one here, it would function more or less identically. It's almost indistinguishable in the result of the application. And this is where we get our three views from. So the first view, view A, is the H1, the paragraph tag, and that comment node is actually representing the location of this ng template here. The view B that we had, which just has the UL with another comment node inside of it, is representing this UL element. There's only one element in this template. And then there's the comment node that's inside of it, which is acting as a placeholder for this kind of third view that we're defining. And this third view only has the li element inside of it. So Angular decomposes this template into three different views. And what that allows us to do is kind of optimize how we update these things over time. Because the nice part of a given view is all of the static stuff, right? All of the static elements and the static text contents, we can kind of deal with once. When we create a view, we know, okay, we need to create an H1, we need to create a paragraph tag. And once we've created those things, they're not going to change unless this view gets deleted. They're not going away. We're not adding or removing elements to this thing. It's not like suddenly we can rerun this view or like re-render and get like extra spans inside the best friend here. The set of DOM elements within any given view is static. And views have these kind of points of dynamic content inside of them where we can have bindings on elements, right? I could have written like, class dot cool equals is cool or something like that. This feels like a very, high school, like MySpace style website that I'm building here. So we could have kind of places in here where we know to like toggle properties to different values, where we have bindings to attributes, where we have bindings to text that gets output, but we can't add or remove elements within this view. With kind of one exception. We also have a concept in Angular of this thing called a view container. And you may be familiar with this if you've ever used the view container ref API. And a view container is a point within a view represented by the location of an element, where we can add or remove child views. So the set of elements within a view can't change, but you can have points within a view, little boxes into which we can insert kind of other views when it makes sense to do so. And the view container for view A here is at the location of this template element where the ngIf was. When you create a structural directive, it creates a view container at that location. And that is represented by this comment node. This comment node, Angular actually renders this. It's in the DOM of your application. And we use it as a point in the DOM where we can say, like, insert before all of the elements of new views when we append them there. So that's what ngIf actually is under the hood. It's a structural directive that, when a condition is true, when its input is true, inserts or removes a child view at the location of this comment node. So all of the kind of dynamic structure of an application, all of the dynamic elements that you create, destroy, etc., in Angular, it's always done at the level of adding or removing views, not adding or removing individual elements. Any questions, comments? Is this making sense?
I have a few general questions.
Okay.
I mean, so around like whether feedback from the RFC has evolved the original plan at all.
Yeah, I think we will get to that.
Okay, yeah, so we can get to that, and then
Yeah.
Lance said he first heard about views in reference to how Signals could or will allow rendering templates.
Yeah.
Smaller than components. It's interesting to see that it's deeper than that. So
Yeah,
more
absolutely.
of a comment, I guess, but.
Absolutely. That is one of the kind of benefits of Signals that we've talked about a little bit, is it might allow us to do per view change detection rather than per application change detection.
Yeah.
So this is kind of what we mean by the view boundaries. And so I bring this up because I think it's interesting to kind of look at how ngIf actually works under the hood. So let's do that. Let's actually kind of write our own ngIf. It's not so terribly complicated. So ngIf is a directive. And its selector is, of course, anything with an ngIf attribute on it. We'll make it standalone because that's the new coolness these days. So like custom ngIf, right? And as I mentioned, ngIf's job is to monitor an expression and create or destroy a child view at a given location when that expression changes. So we need a few things to make this work. We need the view container ref that I mentioned before. This is the API Angular gives you to interact with the view container that is created for the element that has this directive on it. In this case, it's the template, the comment node. And we also need a reference to our template, right? So we can inject our template ref. Because ngIf as a directive sits on an ng template element, it has the ability to inject the element that it's sitting on, which is the template ref. That's how Angular lets you interact with ng templates. And we need to declare our private child view is an embedded view ref or null, basically. So either our child view will exist or it will not, depending on whether the if is true or false. So let's make we need a condition for the if, right? We need an input. And this input is the ngIf input. We use the directive name for that. So you can just bind to ngIf equals something. And this will be our condition. And we can say it starts out as false. Now we come to an interesting question, right? We need to know when this condition is going to change. And to do that, we can use kind of one of Angular's more interesting lifecycle hooks, more rare lifecycle hooks to see used, which is ngDoCheck. ngDoCheck is a lifecycle hook that runs and allows a directive or a component to do effectively custom change detection. So every change detection cycle, right? Every time Zone.js says something happened in the application, we need to check if the DOM is in sync. This lifecycle hook will run. And this lifecycle hook's job is to make sure that the view is being displayed or not according to the condition. So basically, if the condition is true and the child view is not currently being displayed, then we need to create the child view. Otherwise, if the condition is false and the child view is still being shown, then we need to destroy the child view. And view container ref gives us the ability to do this. So we can say the child view is the view container ref dot create embedded view of our template. And we can destroy the child view, this child view dot destroy. I think this is the API. It's been a while since I've actually looked at embedded view ref. No, we actually can't do that, I think. Or yes, we can. Okay. So we can child view destroy it and set it to null. And that's basically it. ngIf has a bunch of different features. It can give you the value of its condition in the inner context, which is useful for a lot of things. But this is the basics. This is the basic of how it works. And you can go look at ngIf's implementation on GitHub. You'll find this ngDoCheck method with a slightly more advanced version of this flow, basically. If I should be showing it and I'm not, create it. If I shouldn't be showing it and I am, destroy it. And it's pretty cool that like this ngIf is implemented entirely in what we would call like user space. You know, anybody can go and write a new structural directive that behaves kind of like ngIf and does the same thing. And we think that's really cool, and we don't actually want to change that. Right? Structural directives themselves are a very important part of Angular, and we're not planning on removing them at all. There's one more interesting thing to kind of mention here, or I guess.
I do have one quick question. Sorry.
Yeah.
So the question is, you don't have to do any magic on if this condition.
We have the if this condition here, right? And the magic is in ngDoCheck. So Angular will make sure that this ngDoCheck method gets called anytime the condition might have changed. That's how the Zone.js based data flow and reactivity works. Does that answer your question, Nathan?
Yeah, let us know, Nathan.
Yeah, let us know. I'm happy to clarify more. So there's two things I want to touch on here. One is that this ngIf, while it is pretty cool that we were able to create this version of it, if I wanted to have a schedule for my week in here as well, right? So if it's not the weekend, creating an else block for this thing is actually a little bit annoying. If you've ever done this in Angular, effectively, there is no else for ngIf as a separate structural directive that's going to use the same condition. I'm assuming I don't want to create another like ngIf not weekend. Maybe my condition is a lot more complicated than that, and inverting it is harder or something. What you have to do is kind of independently of ngIf declare another view. It's the weekday, right? It's better. I'm probably working on Angular. You have to create another view So here we're kind of not using a structural directive. We're just declaring separately, our own ng template instance. And this will create a new view with one element inside of it. And I'm going to give this thing a name. So is like weekday schedule, let's say. And then in the ngIf, there's actually an else operation that we can pass. And the else operation it's an input that takes a template reference. So weekday schedule here is a template ref. And what that looks like when you get down to this ng template world is there'll be an ngIf else input that's passed to ngIf, which is the weekday schedule template. And this piece is just kind of the same here. So we're passing a reference to this view, or this like view definition, right? We haven't actually created any instances of it. We're passing a reference to ngIf else. And so we could implement that in our ngIf as well. We need an input of ngIf else. That would be else template, which would become a template ref. And you might not provide one, right? So we'll say null at first. And then we add a bunch of logic in here to create the else template if the condition is false. So we need to track kind of separately a different view there. And this experience of having kind of syntactic shorthand in the language for defining the if side of if is kind of a nice experience. The experience of defining an else template is something that we felt is a pain point in Angular for a long time. It's rare to see this in code. A lot of people will just kind of copy paste the condition and put a not in front of it. But that is still decently awkward compared to the experience in kind of other templating languages of other frameworks. Another thing we should do with our ngIf custom implementation is support template type checking with it. And that's actually kind of awkward to do. The compiler has some magic points that it can add or that it can understand in the properties that you define on a structural directive. So I can declare that my template guard, I can declare what's called a template guard for the structural directive. And that tells the template type checker, hey, when you see this as a structural directive, certain things are going to happen based on the value of its ngIf input. And so we're saying this should use the binding of the input as a guard around the embedded view that gets created. And eventually that leads to kind of the condition in ngIf type narrowing correctly within the embedded view. So if I do, if I have another, ngIf in my template, and I say like if data is defined, right, then like data here is actually, TypeScript will know that this is not null or undefined or any other falsy value. So we can type narrow with ngIf like that. But that doesn't work super well for the else case because there's no way to tell the template type checker that the else block is like the inverted condition of the if binding, which is a little bit awkward. So that's ngIf and how you would basically implement ngIf as a structural directive. Another interesting case is ngSwitch. ngSwitch is a little bit less used, but still a fairly useful feature in the framework. And it has kind of its own little bits of awkwardness. So ngSwitch, if you've ever used it, it's composed of actually multiple directives because we need to define multiple templates, multiple ng templates for each case that we want to show conditionally. So maybe I have like a paragraph tag that I want to show in kind of one case. So let's say I'm ng switching on like day, right? Day of the week. So ngSwitch case is Monday. It's Monday. I have a Tuesday here, right? Most useless ngSwitch ever. And then I have, ngSwitch default, I think is the template we define for, we're off the calendar. And there's a couple points of awkwardness that I want to point out here. One is that ngSwitch as a directive needs to go on an element somewhere. And sometimes I don't have an element in my template that's kind of convenient to put the ngSwitch directive on. So you end up using an ng container here and inserting this kind of extra layer of wrapping. Or if you don't know that that exists or that that pattern works, often people will put it on it just they'll spawn in a div just to hold the ngSwitch. The same goes for the switch cases. Maybe I don't want a paragraph tag. Maybe I just want to show this text. But I don't really have a way of doing that unless I introduce another ng container here. Just to be able to hold the structural directive for ngSwitch case. And so that's kind of one level of awkwardness with ngSwitch. Another one, if you've ever used it, you might be familiar. ngSwitch does not interact with template type checking whatsoever. So even if this thing is like properly typed and can narrow the type depending on whether we know it matches this string or that string, maybe you're switching on like an enum property for some kind of discriminator for your type. ngSwitch has no ability to deal with that. And the reason for that is that, as previously shown here, kind of the template type checker works by these custom declarations that you put on each structural directive. So you can tell the template type checker how you want to type check any given structural directive. And there's ways here of saying, and NgFor kind of uses this with a lot of power. NgFor can say, I'm going to get an iterable of some array of some type, and the values that I'm going to produce for my template that I'm going to render for every row that I'm going to render are going to be of some type that's calculated from the type of the array input. And none of that is kind of hard-coded in Angular. You can define ngFor that talks to the template type checker and does the exact same thing. But the limitation there is the template type checker does this for one directive at a time. Each structural directive is kind of type checked independently. There is no way for the template type checker to know that this ngSwitch at runtime is going to talk to this ngSwitch case and like maybe render something or not based on whether these two expressions match. As far as Angular is concerned, these aren't even in the same template, right? Or may not be. So they're not on the same element. We have no way of kind of communicating to the template type checker in a way that's generic enough to work with structural directives, that what really should happen is like this expression should be narrowed based on whether it matches these things. We've had various designs in the past on how we might want to do this. The challenge with it is they all amount to essentially creating some kind of almost like virtual machine in the template type checker, where you have structural directives that are pushing operations to a stack, and then other structural directives are popping them from the stack. And the complexity of it has always kind of scared us a good bit. We've so far avoided any kind of special casing of Angular structural directives in the compiler. We do not, these are, as I said, you can write your own implementation of ngIf, you can write your own ngFor or ngSwitch and switch case and switch default. There is no kind of compilation of these things that the compiler does that you can't access yourself. And so kind of looking at all these limitations, and ngFor has its own. One of the things we've noticed about ngFor is that the default ngFor, so I had this ul kind of ngFor is let activity, right, of activities, and activity.name here. And suppose I have some code that like goes and updates these activities from the server, right? So I'm going to be a really bad developer and like set interval to go and pull my server every 5 seconds, and like we'll just use fetch because it's easy. Get my activities, right? So make this async. So post activities, or like this dot activities, right, is await res.json. Sure. I'm just like refreshing the list from the server every every 5 seconds. And if this array changes, right, not only does the identity of the array change, every object in the array gets recreated. Effectively, my activities array is immutable data. I update it by kind of replacing the object identities. But I haven't specified a track by condition in ngFor. And so what ngFor is going to do is say, oh, the object identity of this row changed. I'm going to destroy the child view that was associated there and create an entirely new one. So I'm going to delete a bunch of DOM elements and recreate a bunch of identical DOM elements because I didn't tell it that like it could just track the, maybe I have track by, activity ID. And how many people remember what the signature of the track by function is, right? If I want to write like activity ID as a function, you get the index and then the value here, and maybe I'll return value.id here. And if I do this, then it tells ngFor, okay, don't actually destroy and recreate the view for this thing. Instead, just update the object that's in the context, replace the object for the activity, and the name binding will go and update the text node. So it's the difference between destroying and recreating all of the rows in the list and just poking new values into this binding. Defining this track by function is awkward, both because it has a weird signature and because you have to kind of jump out of the template and define it in your component to do so. It would be nice to be able to kind of write an inline track by function here, index value activity. That's a separate question of like, can we have arrow functions and templates? It's a little bit hard to think about because of the way bindings work in Angular. You don't want to be recreating this function over and over and over. But we could probably find a way to make that work. But still, this is kind of a lot of text to have to know how to write. So the point of going through all of this is to kind of show that the structural directives are pretty cool for a control flow, but they do have kind of, each of them has a couple of quirks, right? The developer experience is not quite as good as it could be. And that was a huge motivation for the control flow RFC that we posted, was as we started looking at these things, every individual problem looks like we could fix it on its own. But when you take them all together, it kind of makes sense to like, let's rethink how control flow works from the ground up, right? Rather than try to fix these as bugs and end up somewhere kind of halfway better, let's start from the top and actually design the control flow that we would want to have. Let's solve all of the problems.
We have a quick question from Nathan. Could it just be key ID, like key equals ID, like React?
You might be able to do that. So I could say, track by key activity here. There's a subtle problem with this, which is there are bundlers out there, or really optimizers out there, that know how to do property renaming on objects. And so if activity is an object that gets its properties renamed, the optimizer will not know to update that string. So we actually try to avoid string references to properties because we're not sure that they're going to be stable over time.
All right, thank you.
Cool. So that takes us kind of into the one of the bigger motivations for the RFC. There are others. We found that Angular structural directives are you kind of have to learn about them very early in your Angular career, and they're different enough from the way JavaScript works, especially with this the star, ngIf or ngFor is let item of items index, right, equals, or let index equals index, or I equals index, I think is the syntax. This microsyntax can be fairly confusing. The star is fairly confusing. The h1 ngIf, an element, from a kind of reading code left to right perspective, this is a little bit backwards. You kind of see the h1 element here, but it's not really here, right? This ngIf is on a different element, the ng template above it. So the new RFC for the control flow syntax goes into what if ngIf, ngFor, and ngSwitch were baked into Angular itself. And the syntax that we've kind of converged around for doing this is this. So this is kind of ngIf with a new kind of new look, right? And the first thing to note is we're kind of using single braces here instead of double curly braces text bindings. And there's this hash character. And this hash character is here. I think we prefer not to have it, to be honest. But the hash character is there because there's this thing in Angular called ICUs, which is like an internationalization message format that we support in templates. And it's a kind of a standard syntax. Angular did not invent this, but it uses single curlies. And so you would do something here like, I don't know, a good example, like day of the week, select, and then there's some syntax for saying, depending on the language or what the value is. I don't even know how to write ICUs, but it's a syntax that uses single curly without the hash. And so we kind of can't put if and else and switch in the same syntactic space. So this works exactly like the ng template. It's doing the exact same thing under the hood as the structural directive did, which is it gets turned into an ng template element. It gets turned into one of these child views, and the contents here are the contents of that view. So this again becomes a comment node in the rendered DOM, and there's a view container there that Angular will create or destroy this embedded view whenever the condition changes. The cool thing is we're now no longer limited by structural directives being on one element. So we can have ngIf with an else. And this was kind of a major goal of the design of the new control flow, is it's using syntax that is drawing from what you're familiar with in JavaScript and TypeScript. So we have if and else, and then there should be a /if to close the tag. So you have if and else, and we don't even have to stop there. We can have else ifs. So we can have another condition, and you're free to put the parentheses if you really want to like make it look a lot like JavaScript. You have case A here, case B, and then like default case. So that's if. Switch kind of works the same way. So you switch based on a condition. You can have a case, A, you can have a case B, and we can have a default. And we'll close out the switch there, default case here. And because this is built-in syntax to Angular, because this is kind of not implemented as structural directives that get created, there's a few really cool things about it. One is that we can actually optimize it. So our compiler can generate like purpose-built IV instructions to implement this control flow. And we don't need to go through the kind of overhead of creating a whole structural directive that's going to manage this, this switch. Or actually, in this case, it's like 5 structural directives, right? Or 4. And the second thing is that we're not limited in our communication with the template type checking. So we can make this completely supported for template type checker, just as if you wrote a switch statement in TypeScript, which is really cool. We're super happy to be able to do that. And for works the same way. For item of items looks very similar to the way it worked in ngFor, very similar to JavaScript or TypeScript. Here we have item.name, except we're not limited by the binding syntax to support track by. So here we can do exactly kind of what someone suggested earlier. I think it might have been Nathan, and say, we're just going to track the item.id here. This just defines the expression that we want the for to monitor. And because for is new syntax, we're actually going to make track more or less required for a lot of use cases. And that's because we've seen a lot of applications have this performance problem of not specifying track by, and then having this kind of catastrophic destruction and recreation of the entire array whenever data changes. And that's, you may not notice it in an ngFor with like 5 or 10 items. It's absolutely noticeable for a data table with like 500 rows. So it does matter in a lot of cases. And again, because we can have kind of additional blocks in here besides just the main one, a common feature request is like, how do I show rows in ngFor? Or what do I do when my array is empty? I want to have some like placeholder text or something that says like no items. So we can just support an empty clause directly in for. And that's basically it. The RFC goes into kind of some discussion of like the particulars of each of these things, whether the parentheses are required or not. We ask a few questions around the syntax. But that's basically the motivation and the new design. Up to the point where this interacts with signals. And the interaction with signals is really mainly for the for loop. Because in signal components, we do per view change detection. So this view here that gets created every row, remember this is a separate ng template. It turns into a separate view with static DOM that Angular knows how to update with kind of dynamic data. And we need to be able to give this thing a signal of when it needs to update. And so the item, the loop variable here has to be a signal. And the new for syntax allows us to do that very cleanly. The old structural directives will kind of still require zone.js. And that's because they rely on this ngDoCheck operation to know when to go and reevaluate their condition. ngFor has this to know when to go and reevaluate whether the array you're iterating over has changed. So without ngDoCheck, you need signals. And so that's what the new for will use. So this will probably be a signal here, and track item as well. I think that's pretty much what I wanted to cover around the control flow RFC. How are you doing on time?
We're doing pretty good on time. I think we maybe have another 20 minutes for questions, depending on your availability.
Sure, I'm happy to.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Then we had a couple questions from earlier on. There's one recent question just now about whether there's any downside from Nathan.
I guess you could say there are a few. One of them is we're kind of moving away from a long-standing position in Angular that the control flow would be something that's implemented in user space, right? There are kind of no privileged structural directives in the framework. And I think that is, that is a real downside. It was very cool that like ngIf and ngFor were things that you could build yourself if you wanted to. In practice, we didn't see that happening very often. People definitely build custom structural directives, but like very few people try to replace the core primitives. And if you look around at other frameworks, most of them don't do this for a very good reason, because they're such common operations that having them built in and being able to optimize them is actually really valuable. And we've been missing out on that for a long time. And it shows with things like this ngSwitch not doing template type checking, but also there are potential kind of performance wins that we could get from it. Probably not great ones because we were pretty optimal to begin with, but there's definitely opportunities. A second downside, and it's more a matter of opinion whether you consider this a downside or not, but just to call it out. You can previously do kind of one-liner if statements, right? And that's not something, well, you can do it in the new syntax. If condition P here, condition is true. It's slightly more characters, but it's definitely a lot more visually crowded, right? So you kind of lose this very concise way of toggling an individual element on or off. I personally argue that this is mostly a good thing. That when I'm reading Angular code, sometimes if you have a mess of ngIfs and ngFors, it can be very hard to keep track of like what is at what level of the DOM. And seeing the if statement actually with proper indentation around it, like you would in TypeScript code, is actually quite useful to me. But other people may feel differently. Syntax is a very subjective thing.
Okay. And then before I go to the next question, I just want to remind you, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat, and then we'll be happy to answer them. We had a question earlier that we deferred. From Michael Faith, asking if any of the feedback in the RFC so far has evolved the original plan at all.
Ooh, that's a good question. Yeah, it has definitely, especially in the defer RFC. I think there've been a kind of a number of things that we've noticed. One of the feedback items someone pointed out was for NgFor empty, it's quite common to have, your items in an observable that you're getting from the server. And if that response returns in like 200 milliseconds, you'll have a big flash if you have the empty block here. And then you render that later. And the defer RFC takes care of this by having some kind of timings that you can specify on this, like only do this after 200 milliseconds, or like have a minimum time that it's on the screen of 500 milliseconds.
Yeah.
And I think we're going to be carrying that over into this design. The same with someone pointed out that like empty shouldn't just mean the array is empty. It should also be like falsy values here.
Yeah. Okay. Justin White asks, so signals need control flow, but does control flow work with zone also?
Absolutely. Yeah, this will not be exclusive to signal components. The plan is for the control flow to work kind of across zones and signals. And that's one of the things that would be very hard to do if we tried to keep the structural directive control flow, because you would have to write an ngIf or ngFor that was capable of operating both in and out of a signal context. And I don't even know if that's like the runtime is there. Operating, yes. Doing it optimally is a separate problem.
Okay. And then we had a little bit of an odd question earlier. Would it theoretically be possible to compile Angular code with the Svelte compiler?
I don't think so. I think there's other syntactic differences.
Yeah.
But some of the if and if I think is wholly like syntactically identical to Svelte.
Okay.
I think Svelte uses each instead of for, if I remember.
Okay.
So that doesn't quite work.
Okay. Alcatraz asks, could we see automatic unwrapping invocation of things like signals and promises observables in the new syntax without needing the async pipe? I think it's a nice convenience in other frameworks.
That is a good question. I think the automatic unwrapping of signals, probably not. Thus far, one of our kind of design principles has been that it should be obvious where a subscription is happening, where which things can change and which things don't change. And so we like the fact that you call a signal to read the value, and that indicates that something is happening there, beyond just kind of passing a constant value around. Automatic unwrapping of promises, I would say also probably not, but there is some discussion of like, should we have the await keyword in a template, and define some semantics for that. It's a little bit challenging because Angular templates are designed to be synchronous things. So kind of, again, going into internals a little bit, we have the async pipe. So you have an observable for data, and you pipe it to async. Angular is a change detection-based framework. So effectively, we're going to render this template and immediately attempt to evaluate this expression. And this expression has to produce a value. But the observable under the hood may not have even emitted yet, right? Or if data is a promise, it may not have resolved yet. And so the question is like, what value should be used in this place before the data comes back, before the observable emits? And currently what the async pipe is doing is kind of converting from this asynchronous world to the synchronous world. Mm-hmm. And it's returning null until you get a value back. And that is actually not the most useful default value, right? Very often you have some idea of what you want to show before your data has come back from the server. Especially if you're iterating over a list, you probably want an empty array or something like that. And the null is annoying both because it may not be the value you want, but also it kind of messes up the types a little bit. And sometimes you have to non-null assert things, and it gets a little bit awkward. And so I think our take has generally been that the conversion from the async world to the sync world should happen in the component as opposed to in the template. And use or to signal the RxJS interop helper that converts observables to signals is basically a far more powerful async pipe. And it's more powerful because you can rely on the value in the template as well as in the component. And you can configure the kind of default value behavior that you want.
Okay.
And like async, it automatically unsubscribes for you.
Got it. All right. Michael asks, will services like iterable differs and key value differs that support NgFor be deprecated as a result?
Ooh, good question. Probably, I would think so. We might deprecate them. We might end up spinning them off as kind of a separate package, or someone from the community might do so. Generally, Angular's implementation of iterable diffing is fairly, we know it has some edge cases, I would say. where it diffs in a way that produces a far more expensive diff to process than other algorithms. And so we do want to improve the diffing algorithm for the new for primitive. It's a breaking change to do that with ngFor, so we probably will maintain the old behavior. But yeah, we will probably have our new diffing algorithm exposed in some way for people to use if they like. But I think iterable differs will become something that is no longer in the core of the framework. Whether it has another home remains to be seen.
Okay.
But that is my conjecture. We haven't actually come to a decision there.
Yeah.
So comment in the RC if you have use cases for that.
Yeah, keep in mind, everybody, these things are still a work in progress. So, your feedback is very valuable and will help us make the best decisions moving forward.
Hans says here, it's not quite a question, but structural directives won't be deprecated. That is actually not necessarily the case. So one of the kind of principles of Angular is we tend to be fairly opinionated about how applications should work, and there should be kind of one way of doing really central core things. So what we don't want to end up with is two completely separate systems for control flow that are both supported equally. So we do want to kind of move everybody from ngIf, ngFor, ngSwitch to the kind of the newer flavors of the, they're doing the same thing under the hood. It's just a different syntax. And so we will have a migration to move existing applications over. I'd love to hear in the RFC people's kind of comments or concerns around the timeline of that. So one thing we've talked about is should we deprecate the new directives immediately? Should we have a period where there's kind of an opt-in migration to the new syntax? And then only deprecate when it becomes mandatory to move over? That's kind of something that we would be very interested in hearing people's feelings on. But the goal is to have one control flow system.
Makes sense. All right. I don't think I missed any questions, but if anybody else has any questions for Alex.
And I'll just add to that as well. The migration is like completely automatable. It's actually not something we're worried about people getting stuck on the old syntax and not being able to update. Because like I said, they're doing the same things under the hood.
Right.
It's just kind of a different interface.
Yeah. So if you have any more questions, drop them in the chat.
And yeah, we can definitely talk about the defer RFC if we have a few minutes left.
Yeah. Steve Whitman says, I love hearing that you would like to maintain the opinionated nature, mainly one way to do things.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, if you want to chat briefly about the defer RFC, I mean, I don't want to go too long, so we'll be here for another hour. But
yeah, it is, the RFC is very well written. Andrew and Jessica did a fantastic job.
Yeah.
Please read it. There's a lot of more detail there than I will be able to cover. I'm just going to give you the basics. So one of the kind of other motivating factors for introducing new syntax and templates is we're not limited to if, switch, and for. We can take advantage of having the syntactic space to do some things that weren't really possible before. And one of the things that we're talking about is defer. And defer, the original code name for this was ngLazy, before we kind of picked the right keyword for it. But it's actually far more than lazy loading. What defer does is create a block in the template, again, this is an ng template that's getting defined. There's a child view, separate set of elements. And here I can have, let's say video comments, right? So here I'll have a video player, and inside the defer block, we will have video comments. And what defer is doing is telling Angular that the contents inside this block, this embedded view, are less important than the rest of the page. And so what we will do is, instead of rendering this immediately, we will lazily load. Hello, yeah, you can just grab stuff, sorry. Maintenance is here.
Oh, no worries.
Yeah, we will lazily load the any of the dependencies, the directives, components, pipes inside this defer block, and only show them whenever whenever they're kind of asynchronously loaded onto the page. So the player will render first, the video comments will render after that. And that is cool in and of itself, right? The ability to say that like certain parts of the page are more important than others and should be on screen faster. Now you combine this with defer triggers. So we can say defer on viewport. And there's a whole set of these triggers. You can read about them in the RFC. But this tells Angular, hey, don't even render this child view, right? Don't even create it until the, well, actually we have to here have a placeholder. So placeholder is like a space that we're going to reserve for the comments, right? So this like video comments, paragraph tag, let's say. So whenever this paragraph tag, if you scroll down from the video on the page, and whenever this comes into the viewport, this defer block triggers, and it loads the dependencies, and then it renders the actual video comments component. So that kind of takes this thing to the next level, I think. You have a really rich set of these triggers. You can say like defer on viewport or when you interact with the thing. You can have custom conditions, so you can defer until a condition becomes true if you want to wait for data. You have the ability here to kind of deal with the loading case. So I can show my like, fancy loading spinner while the comments are actually loading. You have prefetching conditions, so you can say, when this thing enters the viewport, go and fetch the dependencies, so do the expensive network request, but still don't render it until someone interacts with it. So I think this is a really cool feature. We're just starting to scratch the surface of some of the optimizations that are going to be possible using defer blocks. I guess one couple minutes for questions on defer, and then we can wrap things up.
Just a comment on your earlier comment about migration. Michael Fish says he feels like if the migration is fairly comprehensive and clean, then just do it aggressively and deprecate to push the ecosystem more quickly.
Awesome. Yeah.
And Alcatraz says +1 for await keyword. Yeah, if you have any questions about the defer RFC, I'd love to hear that. We still have a couple minutes.
Play around with syntax, right? Like await some promise, await block. This is basically suspense in React.
Await is one of those words where the more I read it, the more I think this can't be spelled that way.
Yeah.
All right. Well, if we don't have too many other questions, I mean, I'll give it another minute, but then maybe we'll let you go. And whoops. Okay, I think we may have lost Alex there for a sec. Give me 1 second. He might pop back in.
Yeah, sorry.
Hey, how's it going?
It goes well.
Alcatraz says, could we see defer with something like future switch statement?
Sure. So there's nothing really, I think, too complex about combining these things. So you can use switch inside defer.
Oh, sorry, I need to put your...
Yeah, it's fine. I'll just...
There you go. Yeah.
Yeah. So you can do this here and kind of, the same thing will happen, right? This defer will be, will lazily load the dependencies of this thing. So any of the components inside the switch, etc. Or you can have the switch outside the defer, in which case only some of the cases can be deferred.
Okay.
Yeah, scenarios like a dialogue where you go through a stepper with conditional next steps. Yeah, you could absolutely build switch with defers of each section.
Okay. All right. Well, it is 6:15, so pretty much right on time. So if we want to wrap it up here, do you want to? Can you send me the link again for the HackMD so that I can share that with the in the chat?
I can, absolutely.
No. And then if anybody wants to take a look at it on your own time, please do so. I can even pop it up on a screen all fancy like.
Nice.
Alrighty, well, thank you all so much for joining us. Really appreciate it. Thank you, Alex, for joining us and taking so much of your time on an evening. And also particularly want to call out to everybody who's participating in the RFC and is making comments there and reading up on all this stuff and helping us move Angular along. This is really exciting for us, and there've been a lot of RFCs recently, and it's really exciting to hear what everybody has to. Oh, my chair just sank. It's really been exciting to hear what everybody thinks about the changes that have been happening recently. So, just as a reminder, this is recorded. So if you missed part of it or you just want to go over it again, it's the same link on YouTube. Apologies again for the technical issues we had right at the beginning, but we were able to get started pretty quickly. So I was going to say pretty smoothly, but it wasn't actually that smooth. So yeah, thank you again, and we will see you next month for the next meetup.